Okay, well, it looks like we are live this morning. Good morning and welcome to the Mount Gilead Devotion. My name is Mike Bridgewater, and it's July 2nd, and it looks like in the weather forecast it's going to get really hot for for the foreseeable future. So hope you have a cool place for today and for the next few weeks to keep cool. Just a friendly reminder before we get started today. This Sunday, we're starting some new service times. As we move into July, our first service is going to remain at 9 a.m., but we're moving our second service back a little bit earlier to 10:30 a.m. So hopefully you can come to one of those services, or you can come to both of them if you want to, or you can join us online for either one of those services as well. I hope to see you on this Sunday on July 4th. So I wanted to start out with showing you this picture. This was a picture that I took when I went to Israel a few years ago, and it is actually of a 1/50th scale model of the old city of Jerusalem. And this was the place that they took us right at the beginning of the trip, just to kind of get us oriented with the old city and kind of level set everything and let you know where some of the activities took place. So most people would recognize this area here. This is the temple area, and that's the temple right there. That's the second temple that was built probably around 530 BC. The original temple that King Solomon built was built back in 900 BC time frame, and that one stood for about 400 years. And then when the Jews were exiled to Babylon, the temple was destroyed, and 60 or so years later, Cyrus the Great, when he let the Jews come back to Jerusalem, they built a second temple. And that's this temple. And King Herod the Great, he actually refurbished that temple during his reign, and that was the same temple that ended up being destroyed by the Romans when they leveled Jerusalem in 70 A.D. Today, the Dome of the Rock stands there where the temple stood. But the building I wanted to really talk about today is not the temple. It's actually this structure right over here. There's 4 big towers there, if you can see that. It's kind of hard to see. And what that is Antonio's fortress. And this was also a building that Herod the Great built, and he named it after his friend Mark Antony. You may be familiar with Mark Antony if you know the story of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra and Pompey. He named that fortress after Mark Antony. And this building is referred to a few times in the Bible. It's not actually called Antonio's fortress in the Bible. It's sometimes referred to as the Praetorium. And this was the place that when Pilate was in town visiting Jerusalem, which he did often during their festivals, that would be his headquarters. That was like the government center, the temporary government center when Pilate was in town. Pilate would normally be hanging out in Caesarea over by the coast, but when he was in Jerusalem, that became the Roman headquarters of the government. And it's also the place in Acts 21:34 that Paul is taken to when he's arrested at the temple. But it's most famous for being the place where Jesus was brought when he stood before Pilate, where he was scourged, and where Jesus was mocked by the Roman soldiers in this area called the Praetorium, and that's where they pressed the crown of thorns on him and gave him his royal robe. So depending on what translation of the Bible you may be reading, you may not see the word Praetorium. You may see the word palace, barracks, common hall, or headquarters. But let's read the story out of Mark chapter 15 and in verses 11 and 20. It says, "But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, 'Then what shall I do with the man that you call King of the Jews?' And they cried out, 'Crucify him!' And Pilate said to them, 'Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him!" So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is, the governor's headquarters. And they called together the whole battalion, and they clothed him in a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns they put on him. And they began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they were striking his head with a reed, and spitting on him, and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of his purple cloak, and put on his own clothes on him, and they led him out to be crucified. So when I started putting this devotion together, I was kind of at a loss of how to wrap up this story. I mean, I had this really cool picture of this model that I took a couple years ago that I wanted to show, and it was really interesting. And I kept looking at this and wondering how to wrap this up. And the more I read the story, I always came back to the word mocked. Jesus was mocked. And when you just think about that last night that Jesus was on earth before he was crucified, leading up to the cross, he prayed so hard that he dripped blood. He was betrayed. He was arrested. He was falsely accused. He was traded for a criminal, beaten, spit on, scourged, and then mocked by the very guards who were charged with his crucifixion, literally adding insult to injury with him. But as we know, Jesus was probably used to being mocked. He was no stranger to it. He was mocked a few times throughout the Gospels. We can read in Luke 16:14 where he says, "Now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, were listening to all these things and were scoffing at him." In Matthew 9:24, he said, "Leave the girl. The girl has not died, but is asleep." And they began to laugh at him. Jesus knew that he was going to be mocked. It's interesting, in the book of Mark, there's 3 times where Jesus predicts his death, and each time he gives a little bit more insight of what's going to happen. And the 3rd time he predicts his death, he says in Mark 10:32 and 34, and he says they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. And they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was going to happen to him, saying, "See, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes. And they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise." So the mocking intensifies while Jesus is nailed on the cross dying. But something really amazing happens to the centurion in charge of the crucifixion and those that are with the centurion. It says in Matthew 27:54, it says, "When the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, 'Truly, this was the Son of God.'" So the mocking ended and the praise begins. And that can be our lesson for today. When we mock God by our actions, by a foul mouth, a bad attitude, being selfish, rudeness, greediness, gossiping, etc., follow the example of the centurion and turn that sourness into praise for the one that died for you. So have a great day. Have a safe holiday weekend, and hope to see you here Sunday morning. Bye-bye.